If I had to pick one thing that is at the top of everyone's dislike list for quilting, it'd probably be binding, and I hope to change that today. So today I'm going to walk you through the process of how I put binding on my quilts. And then after I've gone through the whole process, I'm going to talk about two different alternatives that you can do in binding if you don't like the way that machine binding works out. So let's take a look at the things we'll need today. For our quilt binding, I have the piece of fabric that I have quilted, and I'm just going to put the binding on this piece of fabric so I can show you how to do it on any size project, quilts, bags, all kinds of different things. So I just have this piece that I'm going to use to show you how to do the binding. I have my binding strips, and these strips are 2.5 inches. That's the way we like to cut our binding, 2.5 inches, because we are going to iron it in half so that it is folded over. And you'll need enough strips to go all the way around your project and have a little extra for matching at the end. So you'll just measure all 4 sides and then take and calculate how many of these strips that you actually need for that. I have my rotary cutter and my ruler so that when we splice our strips together, we can trim them. I have a pair of scissors, which will be helpful when we're coming back around to meet the ends. We're using cotton thread today on our project. We like to use Orifil on our projects. I have some pins to help me hold, and then you might want a marking pin to help you with the diagonals on the binding strips. So the first thing that we need to do is kind of get these binding strips together. So we'll take a look at that first. The first step is to get all of these strips of fabric to be one long strip that will wrap around your project. And today I have striped fabric so that I can show you how I get these stripes to match on each of our intersections. When you have a binding strip, you kind of have 2 ends to the fabric, and when you match your strips, you want to match the same ends. So I don't want to put these 2 ends together on, here's my whole long strip here that I've made. I don't want to use this end, I want to use this other piece so that I'm using the same end of the fabric. If I was going to use this piece, I would match this one to the other side so that all of them end up being the right direction when we're dealing with the striped fabric. On our striped fabric, the easiest way to get these stripes to line up when we put our binding strips together, take one of the pieces that you're going to be adding, and we're going to fold that back and match one of the stripes that are on the fabric. So I'm just going to take and match across one of my stripes. That way this is at a 45-degree angle, and we can take and actually match these together. I actually like to take and press this down so that it stays. So I'm going to take and press it real quick, and then we'll look at how we match to this other strip. Now that I have this piece of the strip pressed, we need to line up the stripes. The first thing that we need to make sure and do is to line up this edge that we folded with the edge of the other strip. So we don't want it down here and we don't want it above. We want that right in alignment with the strip that is on the bottom. And then what we're doing is we're sliding this piece side to side until we can get it to match with a set of the stripes. You want to make sure that you're not over here in the selvage where the dots or the edge of the fabric is. So when we have stripes, it might take a little bit more binding than normal so that you can get these to match. So then there across it, it kind of matches all of my stripes, and this will look nicer that way. After you have it matched, then you're going to fold it open, and we're going to pin through that diagonal. I can easily see this fold, but if you're worried about staying on it, because when we take it over to the sewing machine, we're going to stitch on this folded line across these pieces. You can also take a ruler and a marking pin and actually mark that diagonal as well. and it should end with the pieces meeting perfectly on the top and the bottom. Okay, as you can see, my needle's in center position and I have this marked line, and I'm just going to sew right down that line to connect these two strips together. So I'm here at the sewing machine and I have my needle in center position, and I have that line that we drew across these strips right under my needle, because we're just going to follow that line all the way across these pieces. That way, when we're done and we open this up, our stripes match and we have both these pieces sewn together. So I'm back at my cutting mat and I have sewn these two strips together down that diagonal so that when we open these up flat, our stripes match across. We don't want to have all this bulk in our seams, so we take our ruler and we're going to take the 1/4 inch mark and put the 1/4 inch mark on the line that we just sewed through. And that way, when I use a rotary cutter and cut, I've left a 1/4 inch away from my sew line, which is our normal seam allowance. Okay, so then I'll take this back over to my pressing mat and we're gonna press that seam flat. And then also for our binding, after we have all of our strips together and the seams pressed, we'll come in here and we're going to take and fold these so that the wrong sides of the fabric are together. And we'll press this all the way down. That way our binding is a double thickness and we have a finished edge here that's going to wrap around our quilt. So I'm going to take care of that and then we'll look at adding our strips to our project. Here I have my project, and the way that we do our binding is a little bit different than if I'm going to do hand sewing. That's one of the ways that I'm going to show you at the end how you could do it alternatively. So for the way that we're going to do it today, this is considered the top of my project, or the right side, and then this is the back of my project. So when we put binding on with our machine, we want to start on the back first and then we'll sew it to the front. So I have my project flipped over to the back, and our goal here is to kind of start, I leave me a long tail and I'm going to start sewing kind of over on this corner. We're going to sew until we're about 1/4 inch away from the edge of the fabric. You can't sew off the edge. You won't have the ability to turn this the way we need to create our corners. So we're going to start out here. We're going to sew, we're going to stop about 1/4 inch from the corner, and then we'll cut our threads. Then that allows us to fold our fabric up on this corner. And what we want to do is make sure that when we fold it up, we're in alignment with the edge that we're going to sew next. And then you're going to fold it back over, and you leave this little turn here because that's the extra fabric that we need to make the corner wrapping around to the front. And then here, when we bring that down, we want to make sure that our fold is in alignment with this side too. And then we'll go down this side. So to see that one more time. So we're going to start sewing out here. We're going to make sure we leave us a tail so that when we come back around, we have something to work with. And we'll sew, and we're going to stop 1/4 inch from the edge. Then we'll cut our threads. You take and fold the fabric up. This should be at a straight against one of our stripes, and then we're straight on this edge. And then you're going to take and fold back down. And then this piece should be in alignment here. And then we're going to go down to the other side. When we get down to the edge over here, again, we're going to sew all the way down, and then you're going to stop 1/4 inch from the edge, and then we'll fold that corner back and over. And we're going to continue doing that, making sure that our binding does not twist as we go till we can get back around to this front side. So I'm going to sew all the way around, and then we're going to stop kind of over in this point so that we can match these ends together and finish sewing. So I'm going to take it over to the sewing machine and get this part sewed down. Okay, So, important piece about where I'm sewing in my seam allowance here on this first time around. My needle is in center position and I'm going to line up with the outside of my J-foot. That gives me about a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So if you don't have a baby lock with the J-foot, then what I would probably do is just on a scrap fabric, measure out 3/8 and then move your needle with your width control so that you're sewing out from the edge a good 3/8 inch. That makes it so that when we sew around to the front, we have a little bit extra to grab with and our binding looks so much more professional. Again, I'm leaving myself a tail to use when I come back around. So I'm starting down here and leaving this loose. I do like to backstitch when I start stitching and when I end when I'm putting on binding. So I'm going to start with the back stitch, I'll come down and I'm going to stop a 1/4 inch from the edge. If you have trouble knowing where to stop, then just take your marking pin and make you a little mark down here. That would be a 1/4 inch inside from this edge. Okay, so I'm about a 1/4 inch from the edge. I'm going to back stitch and then cut my fabric loose. Okay, so then that way we can turn it here in front of us. Okay, so we're going to take our fabric and then turn it so that it's facing up and back away from me. So I've folded that fabric at a 45-degree angle. I'm up away from me. My strip is lining up with this edge here. And then we're going to fold it back down at us so that it covers up that little V that we made. And then we need to make sure that it's in alignment with the top edge before we start sewing again. Okay. This time I am starting at the edge, I'll backstitch, and then I'm going to go down this side until I'm about a 1/4 inch from the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to stop a 1/4 inch from the edge, backstitch, and cut loose. Okay, so then we'll turn our project. We're going to fold it up away from us, making sure it's in alignment with this edge, and then folding it back down over that V'd fabric. And then we're going to do the same thing for the next 2 corners. Okay, here we are at our last corner. So I'm going to fold one more time. And then on this one, so that we have plenty of room to splice these together, I'm going to stop kind of up here so that we have these tails and I can show you how to put this section together. Okay, so then now we need to go back over to the cutting mat and get these pieces spliced together so that we can finish going around our project for the first time. Now we're back at the end and we need to get these 2 pieces spliced together so that they lay as flat as the other sides. And most of the time this is where people dislike putting the binding together, but let me show you how I get it spliced into one piece. First off, I'm going to take this kind of distance here in the middle and I'm going to cut one of the strips to about that point. Okay, so it's just kind of here in the middle and it doesn't have to be exact. We're just trying to give ourselves some room to work. Okay, I realized that I was a little tight on this side. So all I did was back out some of these stitches on this tail so that this tail was a little longer. And now you're gonna take that piece that you cut off and you're gonna open it up. So this should be 2.5 inches wide and lay it end to end with the strip that you just cut. So this is the piece that's laying on the quilt. I cut this end off of it. I've opened it up and then I'm going to lay it on top of that piece. Now take the strip from the other side and lay it over even. Okay, And make sure that these pieces are laying nice and flat and together. Sometimes people talk about this being loose, and it's because they don't have this laid tight enough down across. Okay, and we're going to cut this top strip, only the top strip, at the same distance as the side of this piece of fabric, so that they overlap each other 2.5 inches. All right, then that way you can see we have the two pieces of the ends, and they're overlapping the distance across one of your strips. Now we've got to get these angled and together so that they're pieced on that diagonal. It's really easy to get these pieces twisted. So what I do to prevent that from happening is I take the piece that's underneath, and we're going to slide it in front of us and open it flat. Then you're going to take the piece that was on top and you're going to open it and put wrong sides together. That prevents this from getting twisted when we're done. So I'm going to do that one more time. So we have the piece on the bottom, and then we have the piece that covers it up. So the piece on the bottom, I open up and then lay flat in front of me. And then the one that was on top, we're going to open up and then slide it over the top of these pieces. Now we need to create this box with those two pieces. You're gonna have to kind of crinkle your project up so that these will lay nice and flat. And what I do is I just try and run a few pins through it. So up here on this corner, I'm making sure that both the bottom and the top layer are laying square against both of these sides. And then I run a pin through that. And this is kind of the fight, because you're trying to get it all to lay flat and even. Okay, so I'll put a pin on this side. And then over here back on the other side, I'm going to make sure that they're nice and flat together. And then we're going to put another pin in that side. That'll just help hold that back even and straight. Okay, so then we are going to sew across here so that we're sewing across the piece that's sticking out. And if you are not able to kind of stitch a straight line without any help, what you can do is take a ruler and line it up with the two corners. So I have a corner here, and maybe it's easier here too, on the back side of this fabric where this one meets. Just make a little mark where that corner is coming out. That way you can really see where that point's going to be. Because what we're trying to accomplish is a line that is very much across the diagonal of that piece. And with a little practice, you get a little bit better at this. Okay, so then there I have the diagonal drawn between those two, and I'm just going to stitch on that line. So here, what we're gonna do is just with our needle in center position, I'm just going to sew on the line that I just drew across these two pieces. Okay, before we do anything else, we're going to take our pins out, and we're going to make sure that this opens up and lays flat against my project. If it was twisted at this point, I would rip out that seam and make sure that they laid flat before I did any kind of trimming of these pieces. Now that I've made it around and I can see that this is going to lay flat, you can use a rotary cutter or a pair of scissors, and we're just cutting out that seam allowance about 1/4 inch away from the stitch we just made. Okay, now I need to take it to the ironing board, iron this seam flat again, and then press this so that it's doubled over, and we can finish stitching out across this. So I just finished pressing my strips together, and I have it laid out flat here. If you notice that your piece is a little long, what you can do is just make sure and kind of even out the bulk by running a few pins through this last little section. I normally don't pin when I'm doing binding, but if you notice that that strip's a little long and you don't want it to pleat when you get down to the bottom, just run a few pins and even out that bulk a little bit, and it will work out the way we need to. So now I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and just finish stitching that little bit between these two marks. So here at the front, I'm going to back stitch, and then I'm going to go down to where I started down here at the end. There, we've made it all the way around our project for that first bit, and now we're going to flip over and bring this around to the front and stitch it down to complete the binding of our project. Now we're ready to finish off the binding on our project, and for the baby locks we have a foot called the bi-level foot, and it allows us to stitch a little easier on that piece of fabric when we bring it up and over in alignment. So let me show you how we use our bi-level foot on this last step. So we're going to take off our general purpose foot, and then we're going to snap on our bi-level foot. The bi-level foot is higher on one side than it is on the other, so I get it underneath the shank of my presser foot here, and then if you just lift up on this front right corner, it'll snap onto place. Then we need to come over to our computer screen. Then we need to come over to the sewing machine screen and move our needle all the way over to the left side. Right now I'm on a center stitch, and I need to move my needle all the way over to the left. So I'm going to select stitch 1. If you don't have a baby lock, all you need to do is use your width control and move your width all the way over to the left. So now our needle is all the way over in the left position. We're going to bring our fabric up and over onto the front side of our project. And here, what messes up people a lot of times is that they're pulling this way too hard and trying to pull this all the way over. And what we want to do is just pull it enough that it meets the stitch line we just laid down. So you don't want to pull it any more than that. You want to have it right in alignment with that stitch line. We're going to put it underneath our bi-level foot, and we're lining up, there's a little notch on the front of this foot, and it's going to be in alignment with the side of our binding, and we're just going to stitch right down the side of that. And again, we want to make sure that we're not pulling this too hard and that we're keeping it right in alignment with the stitches that we created from the first round of our project. And it should almost thud at us because it's going through all the thickness. We want to see that happen so that it's also sewing on the back side of this binding underneath the project. When we get to a corner, you're going to bring up the bottom piece first and line it up with the stitches here on that side. So we're going to bring up the bottom, matching that, and then we're going to make sure and pleat this over in the corner really well. So you're going to make sure and bring it all the way down and underneath, and then this side piece will come up and over, and that's how we create our corner. And it almost nests with the other side of your project if you'll bring the bottom side up first, matching that line, and then tuck it in really nicely and bring your side piece up. And that way we get this nice V here at our corner. We're going to sew down until we can see the needle kind of strike that diagonal piece that's jutting out here, and then we'll turn our project. Okay, so then we're going to turn. Again, we're going to make sure that we're matching right with that stitch line. And then here where our fabric is fraying, I just kind of like tuck it in to the binding, or you can take a pair of scissors and chop it off. Just tucking it in so that we don't see it. lining it up and then stitching down that side. So again, as I come up on my next corner, we're going to take the piece that's on the front of us, lay it up on that stitch line, make sure and tuck your corner in really nicely and bring that other piece up and over, and then stitch down to your corner. When your needle gets to the V'd part, then that's when you're going to turn and pivot to the next side. Also notice that my needle is down in my project and I lift up the presser foot with my lever, and that allows me to pivot and turn and keep it all lined up and straight. When I make it back around to the starting point, I will go across my threads just a little bit and backstitch so that we really lock in all of those stitches, and then we have our project completed. What we like to see is that the stitching is here on the binding on the front, and when we flip it over, the binding here shows that we have the stitching on the binding as well. And we're not seeing any of our stitches out here on our project. And that's what machine binding will do for us. Before we end the video, I wanted to show you a couple of alternatives to the way that we complete our binding. So let's take a look at those. If you don't like taking and putting these together with the V that I showed you earlier, there is another way that we can complete this project, and that's to tuck one end inside the other. So the way that I do that, we're gonna take one of the strips and take and open it up and then fold it down at a 45-degree angle, and then let this top piece here come back over this piece. And then you kind of have this little pocket that's created here. Let me show you how I created that one more time. So we just take and open it up. Then you're going to fold it down at a right angle. Okay, and then you're going to fold the top piece down back into place. And then that should end up looking about like this. I'm going to take and press this down flat so that I have a nice little crease right here. And we're going to take and cut this piece of the binding that's extending below my project. We're going to go ahead and cut it off. I have this little pocket piece pressed in here. And what is really helpful to keep all of this lined up is to take this over to the sewing machine and just sew just against the edge of this, just to tack it down a little bit. So I'm gonna do that, and then I'll show you how this piece comes in and fits inside. I'm here at the sewing machine and I want to tack down this piece that I've kind of overlapped. I have it open. I'm not catching the top side of this. I'm just catching the bottom where that diagonal piece is lined up with the edge of my project. So maybe like an 1/8 inch, I'm going to line up with the inside of the metal piece, and my needle needs to be at center position. That way that little piece is held down, and when we bring the rest of our binding around in it, it won't slide out of our way. For the other side of the binding, we need to cut it so that it is longer than the edge of our little pocket, but not so large that it's in the stitching where I stopped over here. So somewhere between those 2 points, we're just gonna cut off the binding so it tucks up in that little pocket. Then you can see, here's the edge of that little pocket, here's my stitching where I started the stitching, and so I've cut that to kind of be between those 2 points. And there's the edge of it. You can take that piece and tuck it inside, making sure that you have it all nice and flat and pulled back as best you can. And then we're going to take it back over to the sewing machine and stitch down across this. If it keeps trying to slide on you, you may want to run a couple of pins through this so that it lays nice and flat. Again, we are doing that 3/8 inch seam. So I'm lining up with the edge of my foot, my needle's in center position, and we're just going to finish coming down, making sure to take this extra little binding piece and tuck it inside this pocket. That way you still get the edges to be all the way around, and when we pull to the front, we still have that piece that will wrap all the way around for the binding. It is a little thicker there. That's why we typically do the other method. But if we're on a really small project or one of my bags, sometimes you're just not able to use the other method, and then this is the method that we fall back on. If you don't like the way that your stitching turns out when you're using the machine to finish off your binding, so when you're doing that second stitch and you're pumming around and you don't like how it never lines up on the back of your fabric, one thing that you can do is to hand stitch it over onto the back. So for that method, what we need to do is actually in the first round, you're stitching it to the front of the project, and then you're going to bring this up and around to the back, and we're going to hand whip this binding down. It's a slower method and really was the method that we used for a very long time before we had the ability to use the sewing machine to make these nice binding stitches for us. So for that, you're going to use the same thing that we did before and stitch it all the way down and around, but this time you're going to stitch to the front of your project. And oftentimes when I'm making my bags, the last step is to create this binding around the edges on the inside. And it will often, if I try to machine bind it completely, it makes a really ugly stitch here on the front of my project. So this is the method that I use when I'm making my bags. I'll sew it down using the machine the first time, and then I bring it back around and I'll hand whip it down on the inside. So that is one place that I do use this method. So for that, if you've never done that way of binding, let me show you what I do. I have my cotton thread here and I have doubled over my thread. So I've gone through the eye and then it's doubled over all the way to the end. The way that I make a knot is to take the thread and kind of pinch it between my two fingers, and then I roll it around on top of my finger and then back where I have it pinched. And then I just kind of roll it. You kind of roll it off the end of your finger and pull that knot back. And that creates a little knot here on the end of my thread. You'll need that knot to catch so that you don't pull the binding loose. So we're going to flip over to the back and we're going to bring our binding down. And again, we're trying to stay in alignment with the stitch that we sewed the first time. I take and just kind of grab a piece of my binding to get started and then pull that all the way through. That gets us started. And the idea here is that we want to run underneath the fabric of the backing and then just barely catch a piece of the binding. And then you're going to pull that through. And that's the way you work it all the way around. So again, we're going to kind of go underneath the fabric of the back, the green fabric, the backing fabric. So you're going to kind of go underneath, but you want to make sure that you don't run it through the other side. You're just trying to catch the backing fabric, not even the batting. Grab another little chunk, come up and grab just a little piece of your binding and then work your way around. And you're going to do that all the way to the end. You can see how this takes more time than our machine binding, but the look often is a lot nicer if you don't like the way machine binding looks. Another thing to consider when you're hand binding in this way, you're gonna go a little bit of a distance and then you want to tie off a little knot. That way, if this ever comes loose, you only have to fix a little piece of the binding and the whole piece doesn't come out. So the way we make a knot is just to kind of go back where the thread is coming out and loop it back around. And then you're going to pull your needle through the loop that you just created. And then that ties a little knot and will keep that little section tight as it's being washed. I'm coming out here to a corner, so I kind of wanted to show you how I make those corners. I'll stitch until I get to the line of sewing going the other direction, and I'm going to put a stitch right there at that corner. Okay, so right here we're going to go underneath and come up through the binding right at that stitch line going the other direction. That allows that to hold that piece down. And then we can miter our corner and bring the other side open. And right where that wants to match, I'll go back underneath and catch the other side. That keeps that nice and square at that corner. And then I'll turn my project and then go down the other side in the same way that we have until I get all the way back around to the front. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about binding, and maybe now it's a little less terrifying and a little bit easier to complete. I certainly love machine binding over hand binding, but both of them give us a really beautiful project. Thank you so much for joining us. If you liked what you saw today, make sure you like and subscribe to our channel. And if you want to receive those notifications, make sure you click on the bell icon. Thanks for letting us turn your inspiration into a creation.